Hello guys and welcome back. Last episode we built this KV-1 from Trumpeter and did a few modifications and upgrades. And this part will be all about painting, post-shading and then some field-applied winter camo. We begin by washing the model in soapy water. That way I can remove any residue from the molds and wash off any dust. I use a soft brush as to not damage any details on the surface. After drying, it goes straight into the paint booth. I wanted to try something different this time. Instead of my usual black primer, I will be using the light grey. Like in my previous videos, these are the new primers from Galeri's Kaleido Colorworks. Opacity is pretty good and just one coat is enough to unify the surface. I'm not using any thinner here, as the primer is pre-thinned and ready for painting. Here we have the tank once the primer has dried to a nice and uniform matte finish. Next up is the green base coat. For this, I'm using AK's 3rd gen acrylics. I immediately noticed a difference compared to using a dark primer. It's much easier to spot areas where the paint isn't covering properly or failing to reach into the corners. With a black primer that isn't an issue, it just creates shadows, but with a light primer you have to work much more precisely to ensure you hit every single corner. I think I actually prefer dark primers for vehicles like that, since you can already create initial color variations using the dark primer itself. At least the base colors are lighter now, which actually might not be bad at all for post-shading. As usual however, the AK 3rd gen paints offer excellent coverage and spray nicely when thinned with their dedicated thinner. After 2 or 3 coats, I have reached into all nooks and crannies and achieved a uniform base. For my color modulation, I will be using the set made from AK Interactive with these 3 additional shades. And this dark green here is for the shadows. As you've probably guessed, I spray this shade wherever there are shadows on the vehicle. That's why I primarily spray at an angle from below. Besides, we do want a strong contrast here, since the effects that follow will later make everything more uniform again. So if I make the contrast too weak here, you won't see any difference at all in the end. You wouldn't necessarily expect significant shadows on the turret, but the paint serves a purpose here nonetheless. I carefully spray the green all the way around the underside. On large surfaces, like the sides of the turret, this creates an effect of greater size. The shadows are finished now, not as much to do. And as you can see, the difference isn't quite as huge as I initially thought. Next up are the highlights. This medium green shade is now for all the areas that are, for example, illuminated or even bleached and weathered by sunlight. Pretty much all horizontal surfaces are suitable for this. When spraying, I make sure to hit only the open areas. I want to leave the slightly darker shade of green right around the details. Hatches and similar details can be effectively highlighted by making their centers lighter than the immediate surroundings. This allows us to break the surface down into smaller areas, thereby adding more visual variety to the whole tank. You can see this clearly on the fenders here, as I am only lightening the centers of the individual sections. This creates darker areas around the mounts, effectively breaking up the entire fender into many small segments. I'm now using the light green to further enhance the contrast on the sides of the turret. To do this, I spray the edge from an angle aiming downwards. This creates a smooth transition, moving from the darker lower edge across to the base tone in the middle, up to the light colored roof. I'm using the same technique on the roof as I did on the hull. I pick out the large surfaces and raise details and lighten them to create more contrast. This green shade also loses contrast after drying. I therefore go back over the selected areas to lighten them up further. If necessary, a drop of the lightest green from the set can be mixed in. This depends entirely on how strong you want the final colors contrasts to be. And here's our KV-1 with the post shading now completed. The contrasts are strong, exactly how I wanted them. Those color modulation sets from AK Interactive are really nice for this purpose. However, for the last shade in the set, I need a brush now, as the relevant areas are far too small for the airbrush. Using this very light green, I now pick out all the bolts, screws, rivets and everything else small that protrudes. This effect is quite distinctive and certainly not for everyone, as the contrast would never be that strong on a real vehicle. However, it allows us to highlight various details very quickly and easily. Suddenly, instead of a uniform surface, we have a multitude of details that immediately stand out. I used this exact technique on my T-3585 as well. Because Soviet vehicles, with their large rivets, are perfect for this sort of thing. Jagdtiger, for instance, has far fewer spots for it, as it is constructed using different techniques other than bolting. Depending on how I dilute the paint, I can also highlight individual bolts to varying degrees. Edges, such as on those brackets here, are also well suited for this technique. The turret doesn't have quite as many rivets, however I can also apply the paint in a diluted form to the periscope covers to achieve a subtle color gradient. Now I'm painting a few details such as the hooks, exhaust pipes and spare tracks. The KV-1 has surprisingly few tools compared to other tanks. That's actually a bit of a shame, since such details allow you to introduce a lot of other colors. To make up for it, we will use the open surfaces later for more intense mud and earth effects. I'm also priming the tow cables in grey for now. For these parts, the grey acts as a placeholder for the time being, since I will be applying further techniques to them later, once the base effects are all finished. Right now I just want to visually separate them. In the last episode, we shortened one of the fenders. At the spot where the fender was previously attached, you could likely see either bare metal or the factory primer. So I'm going to mask off that area and paint it grey as well. In the next episode, I plan to apply some nice rust effects here. I'm painting the road wheels metallic silver. The KV-1 does not have any rubber rims on the wheels, so all contact surfaces bear directly down to the metal. The next major step is chipping. I will be using a two-stage chipping technique here. For the first step, I need a lighter shade of the base color and a piece of sponge. I dip the sponge into the paint and dab most of it off onto a paper towel. Then, using the lightly loaded sponge, I dab over the corners and edges, creating hundreds of random tiny specks all over the protruding areas. Working with a sponge is definitely faster than painting on every single chip with a brush. It also results in more varied shapes for the individual chips, making them look more random. The downside, of course, is having less control. But in my opinion, you don't need that much control for the initial stage of the light chipping. Many of the chips will be toned down by later effects anyway. As I mentioned, I'm focusing primarily on the edges and corners here, since that's where most of the wear would occur. However, you can also apply a few subtle chips to the larger surfaces, simply to break them up. I am now applying these chips across the entire vehicle, including the turret. It is nice here that the light color chipping really accentuates all the edges, making the whole thing look heavier and more massive. I also used the light color for the shell impacts. I'm not sure if the hit from an anti-tank shell can really still be called chipping, but the same technique applies here as well. As previously mentioned, you have less control when using a sponge. That is why I now take a fine brush to refine certain areas a bit. I connect some chips to form larger ones, add scratches or paint spots that are difficult to reach with the sponge. In my opinion, combining both techniques strikes the best balance between the time invested and the final result. And for step 2 of the chipping process, I now need a dark shade. In my case, I'm using dark rust, because I like the contrast with the green. Here too, I start by using a small piece of sponge. Just like with the light green, I dab it all over the corners and edges. While the light green represented only very minor scratches, I used the dark rust shade for all the chips that expose down to the bare metal underneath. Here, the lighter shade acts as a sort of outline for the dark chips. This emphasizes them more strongly and makes them look more realistic overall than if I were to dab them directly onto the base coat. I used to do chipping with just one single color, but I don't think I'd ever go back to that after using the two-step method, at least not for armored vehicles at this scale. Using the sponge, I now try to fill in all the light colored chips as best as I can without completely covering them. On other models, I performed this step using only a fine brush, but that offers more control. It also takes longer. And since I will be applying further effects over the chips later on, partially covering them up anyway, I will save myself some time and do most of them with the sponge. For the color, I always chose either a dark rust shade, like the one here, or alternatively a dark grey. This depends partly on the tank's overall color and partly on the desired condition. Fresh chips tend to be grey, whereas older ones have already started to rust. My KV-1 was in action throughout the winter and constantly exposed to moisture, so the chips would likely have rusted very quickly. That is why I chose this particular shade. But even here, I can't do it entirely without a brush. I need maximum control, especially around the mounting point of the removed fender. Deeper scratches too can only be done using a fine brush. To do this, I pick up just a tiny amount of paint and carefully drag the brush across the surface, leaving behind very fine lines. Here on the engine deck is also an area that I can't do nice without a brush. The larger connected areas of chipping are actually easier to fill in using a brush. I am doing the second round of chipping on the shell impacts in dark grey. Why? Because the hits occurred very recently and the steel hasn't had a chance to rust yet. This also allows me to visually distinguish them from the standard chipping and make them stand out more effectively. Here I can also show the scratches caused by flying fragmentation. I draw fine lines radiating outwards at an angle from the center of impact. This creates a sort of cone shape where the paint was chipped off by the impact. Next up are the decals on the turret. To prepare the surface for this, I first applied a coat of glossy clear varnish. The glossy surface helps to reduce or even completely prevent silvering of the decals. Like many Soviet tanks, the KV-1 features large slogans or patriotic inscriptions on the sides of the turret. Tactical markings are relatively rare and kept to a minimum. To better conform the decals to the rough surface and improve adhesion, I use various decal softening agents. I will probably have to use a few tricks here in particular, since the decal lies directly over the shell impact. Initially, I considered scoring the decal, but ultimately decided to try and use only a setting solution. And my best tip is to give the setting solution time to work. I position the decal correctly and then set the turret horizontally using my model holder. Then I apply a generous amount of setting solution, making sure it doesn't run too much and stays right above the critical area. The most important thing now is to let the decal sit, as any attempts to press it down will only cause it to slide out of place. The chemicals work entirely on their own, and a day later I have a decal that has settled perfectly into the shell impact. Of course, I can't leave it like that, so I'm going to paint over the impact area on the decal with dark grey again. After all, the crew had painted the slogan on before the battle. The turret is the only place here with decals, so I can now spray the entire model with a matte clear coat. This protects the decals, and the matte clear coat is important for the next effect, the winter camouflage. For this I will be using chipping medium, which requires a matte surface to work effectively. First, I spray a thin layer of the mixture over the entire model using my airbrush. Various ready-made products are available for this purpose, though hairspray can also achieve a similar effect. This layer needs to dry thoroughly. The best way to tell is when it no longer looks glossy. You can speed up the process using the air from your airbrush. Since I don't want to paint the entire tank white, only a few large patches, I'm using masking putty. That might not be strictly necessary, given that I have a chipping medium underneath, but I want to keep some of the patch edges looking relatively sharp. This masking putty is really well suited for this purpose, because it is very easy to apply and leaves no residue whatsoever. In addition to that, it is of course reusable. For my first white layer, I don't actually use white, but rather deck tan. Why? Because the white paint would almost certainly get dirty very quickly in the field, and I want the finish to look heavily worn. The only important thing is to use acrylic paints, such as those from AK 3rd Gen, because chipping medium does not work with lacquer-based paints. I apply the paint with reasonable good coverage, but not too thickly. After all, the thicker the layer, the harder it becomes to reactivate with the chipping medium. About 2 thin coats are enough for me for this step. After that, the paint needs to dry until it is dry to the touch. And now the magic happens. Using a wet brush, I can stroke over the white paint and it begins to flake off randomly. I can influence the result depending on how much water I use and how hard I press. I'm being quite rough here, removing large sections of the paint. After all, this is one of the camouflage layers that might have been applied months ago and has therefore largely washed away. Different brushes yield different results. A soft brush is ideal for large areas, whereas a bristle brush is excellent for depicting scratches and small chips. The risk with this method, of course, is that you have limited control. It is difficult to predict the exact shape and size of the paint as it comes off, so you really just have to experiment carefully. I also highly recommend cleaning the surface to remove paint that has already been loosened or taken off the model. What I noticed was that the chipping medium, which is all over the tank in my case, had somehow altered the green tones. So I went over all the areas where there was no white at all with a clean, wet brush, simply to wash the chipping medium off those spots as well. Now another layer of matte clear coat is applied over the whole thing to seal the first layer. Once the layer is dry, I can apply another coat of chipping medium, though this time a bit more concentrated, focusing only on the areas that are currently white. I don't want to touch the green areas anymore. For the next white layer, I'm going to use actual white from Ammo's Atom range. I'll also need a more precise airbrush for this, because I want to spray the white over the previous spots in a sort of mottled texture. This is meant to represent a layer of paint applied later by the crew, which is therefore fresher and cleaner. At first glance it looks, and honestly feels, like we are painting over all the work we just did. But this step is important for the desired final result. This layer now needs to dry until it is dry to the touch as well. And then the whole process repeats itself. Using a wet brush, I now begin to carefully wash away this layer. This reveals the difference in color, as the slightly dirty white underneath emerges from beneath the bright white. I'm working a bit more carefully here now. In some places I wash the paint all the way back down to the green, while in others I simply reveal the previous layer. There is a lot of room for variation here. And that's why I did all the chipping before I started with the white camouflage. Now, when I remove the paint from the edges, all the dark chips reappear without clashing with the white. One advantage of doing the camo in multiple layers is that mistakes can be fixed quite easily. If I'm not happy with certain parts from the first stage, I can correct them very easy and effortlessly at this stage. In principle, more paint from this layer is intended to remain on the tank, although the degree of wear naturally varies across different areas. Paint washes off horizontal surfaces much more quickly, whereas the sides often retain the paint for longer or were likely touched up more frequently. After all, we want to achieve a certain camouflage effect in a snow-covered area. Next, I need some of this product called washable white color. It is a white acrylic paint that can still be washed off with water for a while after application, basically a kind of paint and chipping medium mix combined into one. Now I can touch up a few areas and boost the opacity. I use a little water to create smooth transitions. I apply this effect quite heavily on the turret. On the actual vehicle, the paint was hastily applied by hand using large brushes or racks, so the finish was rarely completely uniform. I can reproduce this effect by stippling the brush over the large surfaces to give them a more irregular, improvised appearance. Here too I use a little water as needed to soften any overly harsh edges though the brush strokes can certainly remain visible. By applying all the white paint, I have of course covered up the white decals from before. In winter, these markings were often repainted in dark green, black, or apparently even red in some rare cases, to make them visible again. So I am now going to try and carefully paint the decals back over onto the camouflage. I chose red because I felt it provided the best contrast. However, since red over white unfortunately often takes a slightly pinkish tone, I have to apply it in 2 or 3 coats. The upside is that these slogans were originally hand-painted, so minor flaws and irregularities look completely realistic. I left the letters on the green in their original white, just to give the turret a more interesting look. But I have no proof if that was a real thing, so this might just be a purely artistic choice. The gun barrel looked a bit empty just like that. So I decided to add some white with the washable white color to blend it in better with the rest of the tank. And with that, we have finished the camouflage. I really enjoyed performing a color modulation once again, as it always looks really good on these tanks with single color camouflage. And the improvised winter camouflage is a nice change of pace, since it requires different techniques than most other camouflage patterns to achieve the desired result. In the next part we will do all the remaining weathering, as well as the mud effects and some final details. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to never miss any future uploads. Any feedback or suggestions, let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and see you next time.